So, all right. So I'm going to start off tonight talking a lot about a playground. But while a discussion of playground planning and design might reasonably be expected to look at these spaces as a critical site of care, as a place for the work of nurturing and supporting the development of fellow members of society, and especially the most vulnerable among us, that's not exactly the kind of care that I'll be talking about tonight. Instead, the kind of care I wanted to address is more along the lines of what you can see in these two public ad campaigns. Both of these images are from New York City in 1968. And on the left, on top of the bus, is an ad from a campaign that was meant to get corporate leaders to pay attention and to put money towards dealing with conditions of racial disadvantage in the city. That is, to give a damn, was the campaign. And on the right, inside the bus, it's a different bus, is a campaign poster for the re-election of Mayor John Lindsay that highlights his empathy with the travails of his fellow New Yorkers. So I'm thinking we can think of these instances as a kind of mediated care or a municipal care, and maybe ask from there what happens when a city, when an administration, when architects and landscape architects try to show that they care. Maybe another way to ask the question I was thinking is in a way to follow Cornell West and think, if as he says, justice is what love looks like in public, we could ask, what does care look like in public? So that's one way into the story or stories that I tell in my book, The Invention of Public Space, that as I said, looks at a series of experiments in open space in New York City in the 60s and 70s that sought to reaffirm the value and possibility of city life in a moment of urban crisis. These were experiments that emphasized inclusion, recognition, redistribution, such that a diverse and heterogeneous public might fully and equally participate in the life of the city. And a lot of the projects that we'll look at tonight actually no longer exist. And indeed, many of them were written off or abandoned at the conclusion of the period that I look at, and have largely, although I think that's changing now through many people's work, had until recently languished in obscurity. And perhaps that speaks to some of the connections to the current moment that seem to be making them relevant again. But in any event, I argue in the book that they're really at the origins of ways that we think about urban space that endure to this day, for better and worse. In a very specific way, and in relation to this particular talk, there's stories that are very much at the origins of City College's own and very unique programs in landscape architecture and urban design. And then much more generally speaking, I argue that they're at the origins of how we understand public space as a specific physical thing, something that's connected to ideas of both an inclusive urban democracy and very individual freedom and delight. And that understanding isn't timeless, but there's a specific history behind a set of ideas that have really, in the intervening years, become international orthodoxy. So the time period and the location and the projects that I write about and that I'll talk about are quite narrow in scope, but I do believe these very particular stories help to illuminate some of the bigger and more vexed questions around the relationships between democracy, design, and urban space that continue with us today. And certainly that, especially in the last year and a half, have been front and center in American cities, I think also in design education, in a way that they probably hadn't since this moment that's now a full half century ago. So I'm going to start the story right in the thick of it with an image that tells a very great part of the story of the book. What we're looking at is a photograph taken in 1967. It's sometime after March, and we're at a meeting in the storefront space of a community organization on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And so I'm going to go ahead and make some introductions. Standing on the left is August Heckscher. He's the city's brand new parks commissioner, who's here to carry out one of a slew of new high-profile projects that his predecessor, Thomas Hoving, had initiated during his very short tenure as parks commissioner. So Heckscher, who's known as Augie to his friends, shares a name with his grandfather, who's a New York philanthropist who made his fortune in mining. Heckscher Jr., or the third, I believe, went to boarding school. He went to Yale. He went to Harvard. He was an arts consultant to the JFK administration. And obviously, looking at this picture, you can't hear his patrician accent, but you can see his bow tie and his three-piece suit, and maybe notice or infer perhaps the slightest bit of discomfort in these close and popular quarters. And then next to him is Courtney Calendar. So Calendar in 1966, the year prior, had just been appointed the Parks Department's first ever community relations officer. In fact, he was the city's first African-American parks official ever. And Calendar is going to go on to head the city's Department of Cultural Affairs just a few years later. He'll then become the director of the Studio Museum and lead a number of other cultural institutions in the city. But right now, he's just standing here holding a vest pocket park. Or rather, he's holding a model of a vest pocket park that's going to be built in a vacant lot nearby. And it's one of 10 very small parks, hence the antiquated vest pocket nomenclature, right? They're so small, they could fit in your vest pocket if you still wore vests and put things in your pocket. So there are these vest pocket parks that the Parks Department is planning as part of a new experimental program. And the big idea behind it is that there could be one of these on every block ultimately as part of a citywide open space network. So Calendar's job is to institute community participation in planning parks and park programs for the city. And this is a brand new job for a brand new task. In 1964, the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity had mandated that its programs ensure what they called maximum feasible participation by affected communities, but nobody really knows what that means, how that's supposed to work, what that looks like. Now, the woman standing next to Calendar and the men and women and children seated in this space are who we'd call the community. The historical sources I worked with didn't preserve their names, but we have here members of the neighborhood group called Movimiento Puertorriqueños Unidos, which was started by a tenement super, had been involved in a series of rent strikes in 1964. And now they're one of hundreds of groups who wrote and asked the Parks Department to consider putting a vacant lot in their neighborhood to put a vest pocket park in a vacant lot in their neighborhood when this new program of parks was announced. Okay, here's the vacant lot. It's on East 5th Street between Avenues C and D, and it's narrow and deep and surrounded by tenements with the same footprint. And just like in other neighborhoods where this Vest Pocket Park program is going to focus, these vacant lots are abundant and one physical manifestation of the major social and spatial restructuring that the city is undergoing in this period. It's important to keep in mind, between 1960 and 1970, more than 1 million Black and Puerto Rican people took up residence in New York City, 1 million non-Hispanic whites left. Between 1940 and 1970, New York City went from accounting for almost 2/3 to accounting for less than half the total population of the metropolitan region. So what that looks like in what we called the inner city when white residents leave and are replaced by people of color looking for better housing. We sort of know the story. Landlords neglect their buildings. The city doesn't spend money on code enforcement or rehabilitation, not to mention services like trash collection. You start to see abandonment. You start to see arson. And ironically, you have simultaneous conditions of vacancy and density. The buildings that are occupied are overcrowded. There's not enough open space. So the vacant lots that were once buildings and that inevitably filled up with trash and rats were not just eyesores, but tempting and dangerous places for children to play in, and also a highly visible symbol of neglect by the city. This is one in East Harlem, photographed by the photographer Bruce Davidson in 1968. And that year, the Kerner Commission was tasked with investigating the riots erupting in US cities in the period, which had actually started in New York City in 1964 after police officers shot and killed James Powell, a Black teenage boy, basically got shot for hanging out, being in public in the wrong neighborhood. And the commission is vice chaired by New York City's mayor. Now, in the report, the the members of the Kerner Commission put the state of the city's open space really high on their list of contributing factors to the disturbances of the period, which they identify as reactions to a racist society and to the abysmal living conditions in the ghetto. So parks and playgrounds, they write, are an immediately visible aspect of the public scene. And when they're neglected, it's, quote, a slap in the face to the local resident. And these kinds of spaces, they note, can be improved a lot faster and more visibly than doing things like making changes to housing or education or the welfare system. So in this context, for the city, small parks like this one are an opportunity to show that the city is doing something about that neglect. And they're also an opportunity to experiment in more direct forms of democracy. So the city's vision for these small parks is that they're going to work as an interface between the city and the people. They can be a site to forge a direct relationship between city government and the communities most alienated from it. So the project responds to demands for decentralization, whether that looks like community control, which is what citizens are mobilizing for at this time in education and in planning, or decentralization as bringing the government to a street and neighborhood level where it feels sort of more present and relevant for people, which is what the Lindsay administration is trying to do. Now, not shown in this picture, but present in a way via the model in Calendar's hands, or maybe we can say they're conspicuously absent, are the park's designers. So here we have Paul Friedberg on the left. He's a landscape architect who's really at the very start of his career and one of very few landscape architects in the US who actually worked in cities. And of course, not very long after this picture is taken and this project happens, he'll go on to found City College's undergraduate program in urban landscape architecture. And sitting with him is Sonja Johansson, a very young landscape architect in his office who actually did all the work on this project and who went on to become a noted playground designer in her own right. So just a couple of years earlier, Friedberg had designed this Vest Pocket Park in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and it was among the very first that were built in the city. In this case, he worked with folks at Pratt Institute and with a Central Brooklyn community organization on 2 sites that they'd purchased for $1 each from the city to turn them into playgrounds. And through these very first projects, he developed what would really be a distinctive approach. He created 2 parks that were open to the street and really integrated with the city. So there's sort of no separation between the street, the sidewalk, and these parks. He reused materials to create these miniature urban topographies with abstract geometric forms. And according to Friedberg, the way he assembled these came through watching kids who were sort of already messing around in the lots when they were under construction and watching what they did and how they wanted to move through the landscape and letting that sort of be the guide for how the material was arranged. And he called this approach to play equipment or play landscapes his theory of linked play, right? So kids kind of want to like hop from one thing to another and like jump over here. And so creating this kind of connected topography following how kids want to move is the sort of shape that a playground should take. And this kind of design where children are really free to chart their own movement through a space is really a direct response to the sort of dictatorial playground layout and equipment of mass recreation efforts that had been spread across the city by Robert Moses over the previous 30 years. So as Parks Commissioner, Moses, who we're all familiar with, had built playgrounds in large numbers, but the feeling by the mid-1960s is that in these playgrounds, the kids are just that, they're numbers. They're an undifferentiated mass that not only needs to be housed and fed, but recreated. And in this playground, they sort of wait their turn, you know, in line to go up the stairs and down the slide and do it all over again. And so in contrast to this approach, these new spaces are meant to be all about recognizing the humanity and creativity and individual agency of those who use them. Another aspect of playgrounds like the one that we're looking at is that they were also poorly distributed across the city. Very often they'd bypass neighborhoods with racialized populations. So the Vest Pocket Park project is also about redress, right? Behind the project is the idea that now the city is going to bring the best designs to the places that have been the most overlooked. Okay, so there's one more character present at this meeting and in this photograph. It's actually four more people. On the far right, you see a cameraman and a director. And behind Calendar is a sound recordist with his mic. And then in front of us, or rather, between us and the scene we're seeing, is the Parks Department photographer who took this picture. So it's really important to note that this is a meeting that's being filmed. They're actually making a documentary as part of a grant that's funding the project. The city got just under $500,000 from the brand new Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, which gave them its very first urban beautification and improvement demonstration project funding. So we can note here that the park is being built because of a new federal funding opportunity, and it's a demonstration. It's both an experiment and a showpiece. And it's being made to be seen and to be disseminated far beyond the block scale that the park is supposed to serve. And so if you watch the film that they're making in this photograph, which is called A Park on My Block, you can see what actually happens at the meeting. And the meeting is kind of a mess. The residents bring up their concerns to the park's officials. They're worried about things like maintenance of this new park, and they're worried about things like security. The women ask what the lighting situation is going to be, and they want the city to put up a fence to keep the park closed at night. And they press for assurances that the Parks Department is going to act on their feedback and their desires once they leave this meeting. But in the meeting, Hector and Calendar are really careful to promise nothing. At one point, they sort of suggest in response to the discussion of fences that somehow putting up fences could just be an invitation to more vandalism in the parks. And as we see, the designers themselves aren't part of this conversation. And in fact, a big reason that the administrators are hedging is that the things that the women are asking for go fundamentally against Friedberg's design philosophy. The idea that these parks are supposed to be an extension of the city, that there's something that's open to the street rather than a space apart, even though in practice they would be, protected by seating and shade structures so children are not running out into the street. But the philosophy, the design philosophy of the parks seems to preclude the community's actual participation in the making of the park. Now, the following year, the park was finished, and here it is. The pipe and cable play equipment is one of 4 sets of modular play structures that Friedberg designed. They were all supposed to be prototypes for rapid implementation that could be sort of on reserve in a given neighborhood and sort of deployed in a given vacant lot when there was need. But in the interest of creating a stronger demonstration at these original 10 sites, they actually used pavers and wooden topography, although they didn't plant any trees, and incorporated murals and sculptures by contemporary artists. And so the Parks Department built 10 of these, and these are photographs that the designer Sonia Johansson took after they were finished at 2 sites in Bushwick and East Harlem, among others. But at the end of the film, which sort of tells the story of the project, they already capture and speak to signs of trouble in the parks. There's trash everywhere, for example. And at the end, actually the Parks Commissioner rather wistfully talks about what was learned in the process, concluding that what really matters is community participation all the way through. And if we read sort of subsequent reports on the project by the Parks Department, we can read all about the bad feelings and maintenance issues that had arisen at each one of these sites around what was supposed to be a joint venture between residents and the Parks Department. Again and again, there were questions about whose job was it to keep these things clean, and larger questions about how to keep up with larger the forces of larger and deteriorating social conditions beyond the park's boundaries. And in this period, the Parks Department budget would go down, neighborhood conditions were getting worse, and all of the Vest Pocket parks suffered from neglect, sometimes from vandalism. Some of it was overuse, and some of it wasn't. This is a park in the Bronx in 1972. By the early 1970s, several of these sites were officially surrendered by the Parks Department, which is the official terminology for literally abandoning them or demapping them as parkland. Now, at the same time, Paley Park, which is also part of this larger West Pocket Park wave of the period, but with a private endowment and a security guard in Midtown Manhattan, really thrives and becomes a textbook example of urban public space when there start to be textbooks for that just a few years later in the 1970s. So why tell this kind of awkward and maybe a bit convoluted story? I think it does a good job of encapsulating the approach and some of the questions of the book as a whole, and sums up a great many of the aspirations and contradictions and struggles of the period, and attempts by the city and designers to create more participatory, inclusive, open spaces. You see here in a nutshell how a liberal elite leadership and a new group of progressive designers and administrators with good ideas and government funding and propelled by demands from below to redress inequalities and exclusion from the public realm try to do things differently, both because they're trying to make a different city and because they need to look like they're making a different city expediently so there won't be riots, all while the national political culture is sort of shifting before their eyes. And it's very hard. And so if this is, sort of confusing and vexing story, I'd say that that's pretty central to the category that we call public space. So when designers, many scholars and some critics and usually wider publics talk about public space, we're always aligning normative theories of public spheres and spaces that are open to all as equals with some form of democratic control with the actual physical spaces that never seem to measure up. And there's a reason why that happens. That was a big motivation for writing the book and for this project, was understanding that never-ending confusion over how you define public space and the continual disappointment and hand-wringing with how actual spaces diverge from some very lofty ideals. And I argue that that's really the result of a historical process of what actually happened when a city and a bunch of designers and administrators and others set out to create this more democratic city, and what they thought that they learned from that experience. So that's why I've been talking about a meeting instead of showing a survey of all the cool plans and designs of this period, of which there are lots and lots. I also want us to understand public space not as an ideal, but as a thing, literally the thing in Courtney Calendar's hands that creates relations of citizenship. So not too long ago, political theorist Bonnie Honig wrote about public things as concrete environments that interpolate us into democratic citizenship. And they do that not just by being there, by us being in them, but also, of course, in terms of how they're made and interpreted. So a reasonable question people might ask at this point is, how can you say that public spaces is invented at this time? What about Central Park or the Piazza San Marco or a million examples of things that that we call public spaces, but that nobody actually called public space until after this period. And it's not my work, but there's a great dissertation some time ago now by a PhD in planning who demonstrates that quite clearly. So it's only at this specific moment in history that distinct things like streets and parks and plazas and waterfronts come together to be understood as public space, which I call a designed environment with a socio-political function insecurely attached to it. So that's something that's being designed and defined experimentally at this specific point in time, and that responds to a very 60s combination of concerns about conformity and its threats to individuality and democracy on one end, so a very psychological dimension to their function. And on the other, coming out of the civil rights movement and the social movements that follow, a reckoning with the exclusion that's inherent in existing public spaces intended for a homogeneous public, right? They're supposedly for all, but actually exclude vast segments of the population on account of race, ethnicity, age, gender, sexuality. And they they also serve to make that exclusion highly visible. So these two concerns together motivated attempts by the professional shapers of the built environment to make urban spaces differently, and to find ways to include specific heterogeneous publics in them, and to make space for some degree of self-determination and individual development in those spaces. Okay, so there's one other important person in this story who's not pictured at the meeting, but who I've alluded to, and that's the mayor, John Lindsay, who was first elected in 1965 to bring a fresh approach to a city in crisis. And we see him here in a collage that Romer Bearden was commissioned to make for a 1968 issue of Time magazine, with the cover story, New York, Breakdown of a City. And the collage quite nicely illustrates urban crisis, which means a lot of things to different people, but in this case, looks like a social and physical rupture in this city-people relationship. So on top, you see the young and diverse people demanding full participation in the life of the city, and threatening disorder and even violence if they're not. That's a sort of looming possibility that's represented by the wary policemen at opposite corners of the page. And on the bottom, we have the skyscrapers of Manhattan jutting out at anxious angles, while vacant residential buildings crumble and possibly even burn. And their survival is threatened by the accelerating movement of industry, corporate headquarters, and white middle-class residents to suburbia's greener pastures. So in the face of this crisis of faith in the city's survival and its ability to serve as common ground for different people, Lindsay was trying to make New York City a national model of an inclusive democracy. And for him, the city's open spaces in particular would glue together this urban and social fabric that, in this case, literally here is being torn apart. The idea being that new or reused open spaces could show that the city was for the people who had been excluded from the public realm. And at the same time, these new public spaces could demonstrate the value of urban life and contribute to an argument that the city is inclusive, diverse, and very importantly, a fun, desirable place to be. And to do that, Lindsay employed a special brand of spatial politics that was particularly attuned to the power of design and also highly performative. So he did things like walk the streets of Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, not just after Martin Luther King's assassination, which is the case in this photograph, but as a regular practice. And he'd show up to inaugurate Vest Pocket Park after Vest Pocket Park. And he'd bike in Central Park, which was newly closed off to cars and activated by happenings like this one. This is a scene from an event called Build Your Castle and Blank in It that was part of a suite of programs by the Parks Departments for several artists in residence. And the message in a happening like this one is that everyone's participating in this collective enterprise that at the same time is oriented towards self-discovery and individual creativity. So the city's giving people control over their environment, if only in a very limited way. So through these kinds of programs and politics, the city's open spaces would become fertile terrain for experimentation, both in the countercultural sense of making room for activities free of predicted outcomes, and in other cases, as we'll see, because projects are being watched for specific results from which to draw conclusions. So it's also important to note that if the city provided this terrain, many of the designs and strategies employed there obviously developed elsewhere. What they achieved in New York City was a critical mass and a high degree of visibility, thanks to Lindsay's spatial politics and to the city's status as a global media center. So I wanted to talk about just a few other experiments that I look at in the book. And to start with a project that really inaugurated this era, and which in fact dates to before Lindsay's election. And it's also a project by Paul Friedberg, who was commissioned to redesign the open space at a public housing complex, also on the Lower East Side. So thinking back to the playground, the earlier playground we saw earlier, at the Jacob Riis houses here, we can see how the functionalist landscapes of urban renewal were falling short. Here, the open space was really just for letting in light and air and really served abstract principles. So the question was, where do people fit in and where are kids supposed to play? Here you can sort of see them scurrying around the edges. All the green space was fenced in, lined with signs that said keep off. And here, as at many, many other housing developments along the same lines, there was constant conflict around the use of the open spaces. That was really a proxy battle about the status of residents as dominated subjects and not full citizens. And so in 1964, 65 now, I've forgotten. A very thoughtful administrator for the New York City Housing Authority got philanthropic money to redo the open space here, based on the success of an earlier trial project that Friedberg had done. And so Friedberg, in this case, working with a much bigger budget than in the West Pocket Park projects you've seen, created this new urban landscape really focused on use. So this undifferentiated open space was transformed into 4 distinct outdoor rooms, most notably with an amphitheater for community gatherings and cultural events that doubled as a spray pool in summer. And the most remarked upon feature, an adventure playground, not in the European junk playground style, but the first adventure playground equivalent New York style, which was a much more fully realized version of what you see in the West Pocket parks. And that really created this sort of urban microcosm. It was meant to be an environment for children's development as creative individuals, create space sort of towards their self-actualization in the language of the day. And the reception of this project was a really big deal. It was published all over and used for photo ops, and in the New York Times, Ada Louise Huxtable wrote that this project pointed to, quote, the solution by design of some of the American city's more pressing social problems. It's kind of tall order for a playground. Thomas Hoving, Lindsay's first parks commissioner, went to pose in it for a feature in Life magazine, among many other reports. And the plaza met with such success on the ground in terms of how much it was being used by residents of the Jacob Riis houses, but not just them, but folks who were coming from outside the housing development. That a couple of years later, the architects who were trying to get additional money to put a public restroom in this site write and say, it's become a real public space. And so, beyond the huge media influence, the playground at Jacob Riis really had a material influence on city policy once Lindsay was elected. Thomas Hoving, his first parks commissioner, put adventure playgrounds in Central Park. The city's Housing and Development Administration commissioned a study to revisit many of the open spaces of urban renewal projects to sort of follow its lead. So the image in the middle is from a report by Lawrence Halprin for the city, trying to kind of retrofit and adapt all of these spaces. And this model, you saw some of the West Pocket parks that the city builds, of which the experimental HUD program is just one example. And the model extends even to environments on a regional scale. So here, the playground and the amphitheater that Friedberg had started playing with at Jacob Riis are combined in the form of a pool for adults at Harlem River State Park in the Bronx, which is now Roberto Clemente State Park. And this is the first state park in New York City, inaugurated in 1973, and part of a new category of regional scale parks on deindustrialized waterfronts. It's another category of space in transition in this period, like the vacant lot. And so here and at other projects, a push to remediate environmental conditions is combined with an attempt to remediate inequality and access to natural recreation. Part of the social project of the Parks to People movement that had a brief life in this moment. And so in this case, this park was really meant to be a new linear city, following the Harlem River, the railroad, and the highway, basically following the things that were propelling people out of the Bronx to the suburbs. But in this case, the idea behind the park was to counteract the movement of white residents really out of the city, and use the open space as a vehicle for integration. So the idea behind this linear park was that it would work as a connective tissue that seated community facilities like this pool, as well as new racially integrated housing, and create a sense of belonging as different neighborhoods shared resources across local political boundaries. So the park would have 4 nodes, each one with housing, but each one with different community facilities, so that you'd have to share across all the neighborhoods that were connected to the park. But only one node, what's now Roberto Clemente, was built. So these open space experiments are all notable for their focus on various urban peripheries, on their explicit inclusion of marginalized publics, and attempts to redistribute access to open space, as well as a focus on use and individual experience. But you could ask at the same time, well, what about the center? And histories that exist or existed largely of this time focused, or the periods better known for things like the work of the urban design group and innovations like incentive zoning in midtown and downtown planning, things like bonus plazas, things like arcades, things like the idea of having urban designers working for city planning as civil servants. And again, thanks to the urban design group's head, Jonathan Barnett, things like an urban design program at City College to educate them. So I wanted to finish moving to the center with a different perspective on the urban design of the time, and talk about experiments to pedestrianize Midtown Manhattan in the early 1970s. So these experiments are both divergent from and really central to the connections that are being forged in this period between urban open spaces and definitions of citizenship. The concerns with the state of the public realm in the period were in no way limited to conditions in the inner city, right? Midtown streets too were seen as alienating and undignified. They were congested, superannuated, over-motorized, and afforded neither the urban pleasures of sidewalk dining and convivial strolling, nor the sterile ease of access of the suburban mall or office park. So planners in New York City were very concerned with the pleasantness of the pedestrian environment, as they were developing plans to shore up the city's status as a national center for corporate headquarters and cultural institutions. So this plan is from a study of movement in Midtown that Van Ginkel and Associates did for the Office of Midtown Planning and Development, looking at a Midtown-wide sort of network of open spaces and pedestrian streets. Now, on the first Earth Day in April 1970, the city closed a huge chunk of Fifth Avenue to car traffic to house an enormous environmental protest, but also as a test of feasibility of plans that were in the works to close part of the area to traffic. And the results of this day-long experiment were so widely and publicly praised that Mayor Lindsay declared a bunch of temporary street closings on Fifth and Madison Avenues that summer and fall following up on this. And quite interestingly, this, what was called an experiment in returning streets to people, wasn't just a popular hit, but inspired tons of participants to voluntarily report on their experiences in the form of letters. They sent so many letters to the mayor. Letters like this one, from Stephanie Adegi, who signs it Citizen, one after another, where people describe their experience of being out in the street in terms of citizenship, being sort of released from feelings of alienation in the city, a kind of practice of civility, having the opportunity to exchange views and be with different people in the public sphere. They sort of describe all of this in terms that are conditioned by the things that they've been seeing on the street. Things like this March for Women's Equality that takes place just a few days after Earth Day on Fifth Avenue. So the things they're seeing means that they see the street in connection to this idea and feeling of the expansion and experience of citizenship. But while all these pedestrians are volunteering their experiences of these conditions of belonging and being together, there's another kind of experiment going on in the same streets at the same time. There are planners and social scientists studying the exact same places and street closures, doing things like measuring air quality, doing traffic counts and crowding studies. And this other set of eyes on the street includes people like the beloved urbanist William H. White, doing filming or time-lapse photography from a roof on the left, and also the social psychologist Stanley Milgram, who was running literal experiments on social behavior in conditions of density and heterogeneity using New York City as his lab. So here he is at the bottom, posing in front of the offices of CUNY's Department of Psychology on 42nd Street, where he started teaching in 1967, sometime after he made his name with the infamous obedience to authority shock experiments. And so here's 42nd Street from above, where Milgram's grad students did this incredible study that was subsequently taken up in all the reports and work of planners looking at pedestrian behavior at this time. What Milgram's students did was intentionally bump into people on the street to see what would happen. So they'd send folks to the sidewalk to bump into people while their partners would observe and sort of take notes from above. And when they write up their study, they embed just in a footnote a fascinating and very telling aspect of their work, which was they report on the fact that they only did their experiment on white subjects, because initially when they were sending people to bump into people, they found that when they didn't yield to Black people on the street, when they bumped into them, things got pretty heated. So they decided to just remove them from the study, blackboxing the actual political conditions of sharing the street, but drew from the study what they took and were taken by planners as universal conclusions about pedestrian behavior. So this work was all in the service of planning for the happiness of this figure of the pedestrian, who was rather different from a citizen, as this study that I just described hopefully begins to indicate, right? That all experiences of being in public are not the same. And so the pedestrian that everyone was trying to make happy was much more likely to be a commuter or a tourist living outside the city altogether. And that's because plans for pedestrianization in Midtown were really connected to reinforcing the area's status as this national center. So offices for white collar workers, the precise workers who were increasingly living outside of the city, were going to expand into the spaces that had previously been allocated for manufacturing jobs, which were the jobs that employed the people who weren't leaving the city, and the ones for whom a lot of the other public spaces that we've been looking at were being planned and designed. And it's also worth noting, in fact, that between 1969 and 1977, the city would lose 600,000 jobs, primarily in things like the garment and printing industries. And so you can sort of see here plans from 1969, re-envisioning Midtown, you know, especially the West Side, from highly industrial to a commercial, office and residential mix anchored by this new network of pedestrian streets and plazas. So all the same, these proposals for this kind of pedestrianization thrived on a rhetoric of inclusion. So this is a project by the architect Ulrich Franzen for the Upper East Side of Manhattan that he described as, quote, liberating the street for the collective use of the people. A mall on Madison Avenue, a pedestrian mall on Madison Avenue that was going to be Lindsay's legacy, didn't quite pan out. But all the same, the city planning department would start vaunting and talking about making streets for people and more enjoyable public space, as they did successfully implement subsequent pedestrian malls in Lower Manhattan and downtown Brooklyn. So it becomes possible in this moment through a superimposition of associations for something that's actually not very inclusive or redistributive to be seen as a kind of public space that's somehow radical or revolutionary. So around 1974 and forever after, I think we can say public space is dead, long live public space. The ideas and associations behind the public spaces that we've looked at would endure and would thrive, but subsequent spaces benefited from those associations and have developed into a largely orthodox formula for the generation of public life in cities, without necessarily making good on the expansion of publics and their participation in urban life that they frequently imply. So to sort of simplify, again, a complex narrative and the sort of combination of this analysis with a sort of intensely detailed history, two sort of fundamental conclusions. One being that urban public space as this specific thing connected to ideas of both an inclusive urban democracy and individual delight is again a historical product, and as such, not necessarily an unmitigated good, right? It's not an ideal thing, but a contradictory thing. And second, when thinking public space, to think publics plural, how they're included, how they're elided. At its best, public space can materially and symbolically make way for inclusion of more people in the life, and just as importantly, in the making of the city. We have to try really hard. It's continuous work, and it can't transcend fundamental social conditions, though it can open new avenues forward. And these are contradictions and challenges that are no less familiar today in this moment, which is really another point of inflection when it comes to the future of the city and the public realm, and questions of and who and what it's for. So the past year especially has made a lot of this much more self-evident to many more people than I think perhaps it had felt before then, in terms both of a more generalized understanding in American society of the violent exclusion that plays out in policing racial hierarchy in public spaces, and at the same time in the last year in the real flowering of spaces of mutual aid and care in the city. And so following from that, one can ask the questions of how is that formalized? What role might design play? And so the legacy, if it's fair to use that word at this point, of last year's Black Lives Matter protests, along with pandemic concerns with the economic viability and future of the city, I think leave us right back here on the street again as a site of transformative possibility, or possibly not. So to keep things local, and to bring things to the present, I think the ongoing story of New York City's Open Streets program and their promises and failures thus far is instructive. The initial and extraordinarily uneven rollout in the summer of 2020 of the city's open streets immediately reminded me of some of the more uneven, if not to say absolutely dismal, street interventions that I had encountered in the archives, looking at projects of the Lindsay administration. Above is a play street in Brownsville, photographed in 1968. And below an open street in early spring 2020 in Crown Heights, photographed by one of the planners whose job it was to go put the dividers in. And so last year, the early reliance on the police to set these things up, the enormous disparity in their distribution, which was confirmed in a study just last week, suggests that some things might look better today and some things might look worse. And some things might look exactly the same. When we consider, for example, how quickly the focus on accommodating fancy restaurants on the street, right? Restaurants whose publics and locations overlap with those of people with power, and also sometimes where, what planners like and where they live. When these really seriously eclipse the commitment to extraordinarily needed and free and joyful social infrastructure to accommodate children and pedestrians and other publics. And interestingly enough, the need for municipal focus on public space in terms of equity and maintenance today, right now is being voiced, I think, most explicitly by the urban designer Justin Garrett Moore, who worked for a very long time for the city of New York. To make that happen, he's been calling very much for the creation of a new Department of Care. And so I think I will leave things there. Thank you. Thank you. Well, maybe to let people gather thoughts, or if they have questions, just to your point, Vijayanti, it's true. This started, the research for this book so long ago. That one of the strange things in the whole project was seeing how many, things and waves and moments and trends in a way we've sort of lived through when it comes to the design and planning of public space in the last, I don't even want to think, how many years. And the historical resonances and really just the repetition, much of this started early on from what a fascinating set of projects. It seemed to be responding to what everybody at that particular moment, which I don't want to say how long ago, in the School of Architecture thought was so cool, and being like, do you know that all of this already happened? And so, which is useful precedent and valuable to know. But I mean, it's interesting. I don't know, to sort of measure that and sort of ask, okay, well, what have we learned? How far have we come? How much are we sort of repeating? And especially, I think in this moment, the exact same set of difficult problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe I could ask a question. I find, so thank you very much, first of all, for the very challenging lecture. I found very provocative, really, your idea that we think of public space as basically the ultimate sort of democratic good, and you challenge that quite radically. And I'm wondering if you could expand a bit on that, and also perhaps discuss. I'm thinking now of the pedestrianization project that you showed, as well as the street closing in the past year and a half, and the opening of restaurants. And if you could say something also about the relation or entanglements between public and private space. So in fact, the story of public space is also a story of, it has often served basically as the vessel for private interest, rather than a space for the public or for the publics in the plural. And I know that, so this was certainly, or it seems to be certainly the case with many of the street closing today, but I'm wondering if those kind of issues came up also in particular in the Midtown pedestrian project. Anyway, I think so. I'd like to elaborate more on this public-private divide, and really the argument of thinking sort of more complexly in a more complex way about the public good, and so the public space as this difficult, let's say, type of public good. Yeah.
Okay. Lots of questions and hard ones, I think, to try to tackle there. I mean, to the private public question, it's let's see, it's hard. I mean, one thing that I think is also reacting to, and this comes from the historical research, and I think probably the experience many people have shared of doing things like trying to teach these histories or teach people who are supposed to be placemakers, and ending up having very frustrating conversations, where you get stuck in the sort of like, but wait, is this a public space or isn't this a public space? Because this thing is fenced off, or this thing is privately owned, or this thing is, I wanted to, I think I was frustrated by the focus that we seem to sort of frequently end up with about these questions, in sort of categorical yes or no of who owns it, is it private or public, which already something like the space that I was looking at, the public housing open spaces, were absolutely sort of, didn't function along those lines in terms of the sort of blurring of those lines of what kind of a space is the space that is of a residential complex that belongs to the state, but is again, sort of nominally daily life space. Looking forwards, I'm really gonna ramble because there are so many sort of pieces to try to tie together here. Okay, so I think the frequency with which we sort of try to get into this stuff from the kind of question of there's a checklist kind of who owns it or who controls access, and if which corresponds to a certain kind of purity, maybe, like, oh, okay, well, this is like, and speaks to that ideal, right, that somehow public space is this thing that should be publicly owned, whatever that means, and publicly accessible, whatever that means, when in reality there are all of these gradations, and when that idea is so easily then manipulated, to sort of sell things that are not very public at all, in the sort of name of like, look, but we added more public space, whether that's the developer who says, hey, I built this tower, but look at this great space, or somehow I remember, and it really got stuck in my head, this was so long ago too, the whole controversy over the renovation of the New York Public Library Central Research Branch, when they were going to sort of kick everybody out and all of the books, but it was all sort of sold under, this is great for everybody because there's going to be more public space, which was this like very particular kind of seating, that would nominally be available to all. So anyway, all of this to say, they just found that those absolutes weren't useful categories to kind of get at the complexity of what goes on when you get into a specific site, is sort of part one. Part two, to the question of ownership, one thing that, and if I'm remembering correctly at this point, that wasn't really so much the issue in these kinds of projects, and that really emerges out of this period, once you get things, like the plazas and the bonus and all the weird privately owned public space that the urban design group makes possible, or in the other direction, all the kind of, which I didn't talk about, but really sort of community space, like say a community garden, that ends up being what a lot of groups, but also nonprofits, start pushing when things like the Vest Pocket Parks fail. So you sort of move from this kind of attempt to find some kind of synthesis or expansion of something that is, municipal and related to the city, but open to all in all kinds of directions of sort of sub-community spaces that are not. And so what are these things? And so that, I think is a process that's certainly underway at this time, right? That historians can write a lot better about, in terms of the sort of neoliberalization of the city, that these kinds of projects, I think, play a really interesting role in, given that the sort of forms that we see later and are so used to sort of saying, well, like, that's not really public, or something like Paley Park, come out of these experiments with somewhat different impulses that then sort of let you read those same kind of impulses or desires in them. So I don't think this is a good answer at all, but I'm sort of trying to like catch and fail in a way to sort of resolve some of what ends up happening there. I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is that in some ways, I think those questions have obviously become so accentuated given the political economy of the city moving forward from this period, which was a really intense transition. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
I think Rihao had a question.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
I've been thinking how to articulate this question even, but first, I want to say thank you about the presentation. It was fantastic to know, that history. And I think, one theme I sort of heard in your presentation is this idea of experiment, in a way that I think it takes courage to experiment, because you have to accept failure. In a way, come with experiment comes with failure. And I guess this question, it's not really a question, but I just want to sort of hear your thought about it. Is that more and more when currently we see is that, or can I ask, are we sort of lose that courage to experiment now? Because a lot of the projects has to be justified in terms of some performative outcomes. They want to know whether there's going to be a successful project or not in order to build it. But by doing that, we lose the opportunity to really experiment and find something new or some new possibilities. I guess, yeah, this is not really a question, but just I want to sort of hear your sort of thoughts on the idea of experiment and whether we lose the courage to experiment now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great, it is mostly a question, I mean, for me, what, a couple of things on that. One, that sort of issue of experiment and conclusions, I think is really important here. And I think speaks to, like 1 second tried to mention, different approaches to experiment, right? One, which is the kind of like art idea, right, of we're going to experiment and we don't know how it's going to work out, but it's like cool and exciting and awesome and transformative to like see what happens if we do things differently. And the other strand that's really like coming straight out of and through like behavioral psychology, right, of like we're going to do these experiments and see if we change environment, what's it going to do to behavior. And both are kind of going on at that time. One of the things that bothered me a lot and sort of motivated this project early on was this kind of categorical dismissal of a lot of these experiments as, oh, they failed, in a language that tried to be very scientific, but was, I don't know, to be crass, just absolute bullshit in the sense that the conclusions were sort of drawn without any ability to sort of see the experiment through, so if you tried to do something and then there wasn't funding anymore, like that was it. The conclusion is this doesn't work and we should never do this again because it didn't work, as opposed to kind of thinking through why didn't it work? So, I mean, your question had me thinking about things like vaccines, right? And like, say you wanted to come up with a vaccine for some infectious disease and you tried something and it didn't work. Would you say, this failed, we're not going to try anymore? Or like, let's iterate and keep figuring this out. And I think, for a time, one of the things that's sad about this story, and I do agree, is there was this, grafting of, kind of scientific and categorical experiment idea to say, oh, this experiment has concluded and we're done here. Which, perhaps didn't allow it to see through some of the learning that was possible, through trial and error, which if it had continued, maybe we would have, learned a little bit more, be a little better at this point, in what's been learned. I mean, as to whether that's possible or not today, that makes me want to say, as a historian, I choose not to answer. But as we're talking about it, again, I think two thoughts. One is thinking about things like playgrounds, which, the book is only partly about playgrounds, but they are such an important, model for an approach. Certainly you can look at what's happened there and the sort of trajectory, from a certain kind of cultural excitement about and tolerance for risk and trying different things for an absolute no, like this is the thing that's approved and safe and we only do this, which is changing now in some cases again, which I think is interesting. But in the other direction, I think there's a way, again, just purely looking at what goes on here, that there's a certain kind of experimentalism that's still very much alive and well, in the sense I'm thinking about things like the Open Streets or Plazas program that follow this very interesting, kind of like proof of concept model where it's like, you can try this experiment and if it does okay, like we'll do it a little bit more permanent temporary. And if that goes okay, you know, like maybe we'll try it again in a slightly more permanent way. So all of this to say, I guess, I don't know that, you know, that there is not, you know, like room or tolerance for, you know, for experimentation today. And if anything, you know, I think the sort of comparison is that times of, you know, of great tumult are good ones for trying different things, you know, from what's been tried before. So if ever there were a time that were ripe for experimentation, it would be the present.
I was typing my thing out, but I was taking too long. I'm curious in terms of experimentation and this perhaps flawed approach where we scrap experimentation based on what you saw in the Lindsay era. What would you iterate upon? What do you think were the successful ideas? Or were there any?
Well, I mean, yes, I think I think there were many, you know, and I think that starts with, you know, things in a way. This gets back to Chizette's first question, you know, about where, you know, where should a city and its money and designers' attention, you know, go when it comes, for example, to the creation of these kinds of spaces. Again, the sort of look today, you know, the sort of shift, right? And again, this follows the same line, right, of, you know, the landscape that is public good because it's an attractive tourist destination somewhere that doesn't need it, you know, versus the idea of a kind of distributed, you know, network of infrastructure, to use that word, that, you know, serves need, you know, to come back to, you know, in every moment we have our sort of words, right? But if you were going to sort of look back at that moment and reflect forward, you know, the idea that things that we like to talk about now, you know, is like equity is, you know, an important value when sort of thinking about planning and design, and you know, is one. So I don't know. I think, you know, things also like the value, you know, of a government that does put some value in doing new things, and what designers who might be untested bring to the equation. And I think also, you know, one thing that that's quite beautiful, you know, in these designs and in their intention is that sort of, you know, very normative but sort of valuable celebration of urbanity, or really sort of a attempt to not, you know, get away from it, but sort of intensify and improve upon it in the urban landscape, you know, which still I think rings appealing today. So I'd say that there's much, you know, in terms of starting with being more thoughtful again, you know, in designing shared spaces, about thinking specifically, you know, about who's using them. You know, you can sort of start there. I guess lots of things.
Mariana, there seems to be some glitch in the chat, and there's a couple of questions. Well, one question from Cheryl Gleason that came to me directly, okay. In which she asks, I guess following up on Nicholas's question, or are there examples of particular successes of recent decades? So.
You know, again, I'd say, like, not as a designer, I hate to, it's not for me, or I'm not inclined to say this is a success, this is a failure. For me, what's kind of most interesting about all of these projects is how all of these difficulties play out and have to be grappled with through them, you know. So everything is imperfect, you know, in that way. I mean, a project that I think about, you know, a lot that I didn't talk about, but that's in the book. Not, I know we're not actually there, but not too far away. Is, you know, I think the project, although, you know, also super compromised and complicated, of Riverbank State Park is a really interesting and I think instructive in this moment legacy. So this starts with sort of enormous mobilization against the siting of this enormous wastewater treatment plant right on the Hudson River, smack in the middle of West Harlem, which was a really messed up thing to do and shouldn't have happened in the first place. But I guess the positive is that, you know, of course, it always takes this, such was the pressure at this time, you know, to oppose this, that it did bring about really, really interesting and novel thinking about, you know, tool use infrastructure and what would it look like to put a park on this site, and how do you kind of combine these you know, structures for remediation with environmental assets that are, you know, accessible and a plus for the neighbors. So I think, you know, a project like that, if we're going to say success, even though that's very complicated and there were incredible ideas for it that were watered down, and, you know, the plant was still sinky and that had to be fixed, and it's kind of an endless struggle, right? And it's all an endless struggle. That's one, that's the example that comes to mind.